The screen door slammed shut, the sound of finality that echoed the chasm growing between me and Dad. Inside, Grandma's clock ticked with infuriating regularity, each tick measuring the seconds I wanted to rewind, words I wanted to swallow. But it was done. He was gone. He wanted me there. In that circus. With her, and especially with him. Ugh. My real name is Ethan, but right now I feel like nothing but a raw nerve. Dad, Liam, had been pushing it for weeks, ever since the damn wedding. The blended family bullshit. The new chapter. I hated it all. Hated the way he looked at me, all hopeful and pleading, like I held the key to some domestic utopia he was desperate to unlock. They could really use you, Ethan. His words hung in the air, thick with guilt, like I was abandoning him, abandoning them. Them. Deb and her brood. A ready-made family, complete with a volatile, ticking time bomb named. Let's just call him K. He was the reason I refused to even visit anymore. 6 or 7 awkward, tense encounters were more than enough. K radiated a simmering rage, a possessiveness over everything. His space, his games, his mother, that made my skin crawl. I'd seen the way he treated his younger siblings. The glares, the shoves, the whispered threats that even I could pick up on. And Deb? She walked on eggshells, trying to placate him, to smooth things over. Dad, bless his naive heart, thought he could fix it. That I could fix it. Their safety is a big concern right now, he'd said, his voice laced with desperation. As if I was some kind of superhero, obligated to protect these people I barely knew, from a threat I wanted nothing to do with. Why is that my duty? The words had exploded out of me, fueled by months of suppressed resentment. Why do you think your new stepkid's safety is my problem? You signed up for this, Dad. I didn't. The hurt in his eyes had stung, but I couldn't back down. Not this time. I'd spent years adapting to his whims, moving from place to place after Mom died, never quite feeling settled. This was my line in the sand, my stake in the ground. This is the kind of problem we take on when we become a family, he'd countered, his voice tight. They're not my family, I'd repeated, the words like a mantra. You made them yours. I'm choosing not to. And then he'd said it, the words that had cut deeper than I thought possible. That means you and I aren't family too, then. The silence that followed was deafening. It stretched, taut, and unforgiving until I finally managed to choke out, if that's how you take it, then yeah. His face had crumpled, just for a second, before he masked it with disappointment. I'm disappointed in you, Ethan. Dismissing the safety of his stepkids. I'm disappointed you wanted to put me in this position to begin with. I'd shot back, the words laced with venom. So we can stay disappointed with each other. He'd left then, slamming the door behind him, leaving me standing there, hollowed out and strangely numb. I glanced around the familiar kitchen. Grandma's floral wallpaper, the worn linoleum floor, the smell of her apple pie cooling on the counter. This was my sanctuary, my refuge from the chaos that was Dad's life now. I couldn't leave it. Not for him, not for them, but the guilt was already gnawing at me. A slow, insidious poison. Was I being selfish? Was I truly abandoning my father in his time of need? Grandma bustled in, her face etched with concern. You boys all right? I forced a smile. Yeah, Grandma. Just talking. She didn't believe me, I could tell. But she didn't push it. She never did. That was her way of showing love. Pie's ready, she said, patting my arm. Come on, let's have a slice. I followed her to the table, the familiar routine a small comfort in the face of the storm raging inside me. As I ate, I couldn't shake the image of Kay's face, of the suppressed fury simmering beneath the surface. And Dad, caught in the middle, trying to hold it all together. I didn't want to be a hero. I just wanted things to go back to the way they were. Before Deb. Before Kay. Before everything got so complicated. But deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. Things had changed, and I had a feeling they were about to change a whole lot more. The following days were a blur of forced normalcy. School, homework, helping Grandma with chores. I tried to keep my mind occupied, to block out the gnawing worry that threatened to consume me. But every time the phone rang, my heart would leap into my throat. Every time a car pulled into the driveway, I'd find myself peering through the curtains, half expecting to see Dad. He didn't call. He didn't come by. The silence was deafening. Grandma, bless her heart, tried to distract me. She told me stories about Dad when he was my age, funny anecdotes about his mischief and his dreams. She baked my favorite cookies, did my laundry, and generally smothered me with the kind of unconditional love that only a grandmother could provide. But even her unwavering affection couldn't fill the void. The truth was, I missed him. I missed our late-night talks, our shared love of old movies, the comfortable silence that we often fell into. He was my dad, my only family left besides Grandma and Grandpa, and now it felt like I was losing him. Then, on Friday night, the call came. I was in my room, headphones on, trying to lose myself in a video game when the landline rang. Grandma answered it downstairs, and I barely registered the murmur of her voice until she called out, her voice tight with concern. "Ethan, it's for you." "It's Liam." My stomach lurched. I ripped off my headphones and raced downstairs, my hands clammy. I grabbed the phone, my voice barely a whisper. "Dad?" His voice was strained, almost frantic. "Ethan, thank God. I need you to come over here." "What's wrong?" My heart hammered against my ribs. "What happened?" It's Kay. He lost it. He hurt his sister, and Deb can't control him." I don't know what to do. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew it. I knew something like this was going to happen. "Hurt her? How bad?" "She's okay. She's going to be okay. Just a cut on her arm. But he's completely out of control. He's barricaded himself in his room, and he's yelling, screaming. I don't know what he's going to do." I could hear the desperation in his voice, the fear that he was trying to mask. It was a sound I hadn't heard since Mom died. "Dad, please, Ethan," he interrupted, his voice cracking. "I need you. They need you. Just come over here. Please." The plea in his voice was my undoing. All the resentment, all the anger, all the stubborn defiance melted away, replaced by a surge of protectiveness. He was my dad, and he was in trouble. "Okay," I said, my voice trembling. "Okay, I'm coming." I hung up the phone, my mind racing. I ran to Grandma, who was standing in the doorway, her face pale with worry. "Grandma, I have to go. Dad needs me." "Ethan, what's going on?" I quickly explained the situation, glossing over the details but conveying the urgency of the situation. Her eyes widened with fear. "Ethan, you can't go there." "That boy, he's dangerous. I know, Grandma. But Dad needs me. I can't just stand here and do nothing." She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't put yourself in danger." "I promise," I said, although I wasn't sure I could keep it. I grabbed my keys and ran out the door, my heart pounding in my chest. As I sped down the highway, I tried to prepare myself for what I was about to face. But nothing could have prepared me for the scene that awaited me at Dad's house. The house was in chaos. Even from the driveway, I could hear the shouting, the high-pitched sobs of a child. The air crackled with tension, thick and suffocating. I parked the car and rushed to the front door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside. Deb was in the living room, kneeling beside a small girl with tears streaming down her face. A bandage was wrapped around the girl's arm, stained with blood. Another younger boy huddled behind Deb, his eyes wide with terror. "Ethan?" Deb looked up, her face etched with exhaustion. "Thank God you're here. Where's Dad?" I asked, my voice tight. "Upstairs. He's trying to talk to Kay. The shouting intensified, a guttural roar that sent shivers down my spine. It was coming from upstairs, from behind a closed door. "What happened?" I asked Deb, keeping my voice low so the children wouldn't hear. "He just snapped," she said, her voice trembling. "He was playing video games and his sister. She just wanted to watch. He told her to go away, but she wouldn't. He grabbed a knife." I don't know what he was thinking. The image of Kay wielding a knife against his own sister made my stomach churn. He wasn't just angry. He was dangerous. "I'm going up there," I said, steeling myself. Deb reached out and grabbed my arm. "Ethan, be careful. He's not himself." I nodded, pulled away, and headed for the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, amplifying the tension in the air. As I reached the top of the stairs, I could hear Dad's voice, low and pleading, coming from behind the closed door. "Kay, son, please. Open the door. Let's talk about this." "Get away from the door," Kay roared from inside the room. "I don't want to talk to you. Just leave me alone." "We can't leave you alone, Kay," Dad said, his voice strained. "We're worried about you. We want to help you." "Help me? You want to lock me up. You want to send me away." "No, Kay, that's not true. We just want you to get the help you need." "I don't need help. I'm fine. Just leave me alone." I reached the door and pressed my ear against it. The room was silent for a moment. Then I heard the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. "Kay?" Dad said, his voice laced with apprehension. "What are you doing?" "I'm protecting myself," Kay yelled. "You're not coming in here." I looked at Dad, his face pale and drawn. He shook his head, a silent plea for me to stay back. But I couldn't. I couldn't just stand there and listen to him beg. "Dad, move," I said, my voice firm. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside. I took a deep breath, balled my fist, and slammed it against the door. The wood splintered around the doorknob, but the door didn't budge. "Kay, open the door," I shouted. "It's Ethan." "I want to talk to you." "Ethan?" His voice was wary. "What do you want?" "I want to help you, Kay. But I can't do that if you keep the door locked." There was a long silence. Then I heard the sound of the barricade being moved away from the door. Slowly, cautiously, the door creaked open. I stepped into the room, my heart pounding in my chest. Kay was standing in the middle of the room, his eyes wild and bloodshot. The room was a mess, with overturned furniture and scattered toys. A heavy dresser was pushed against the window, blocking out the light. He looked like a cornered animal, ready to lash out at anyone who came near him. "Ethan," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "I came to talk to you, Kay," I said, keeping my voice calm and steady. "I want to understand what's going on." "You can't understand," he said, shaking his head. "Nobody can understand. Try me," I said, taking a step closer. He flinched, as if expecting me to attack him. Just stay away from me. "I'm not going to hurt you, Kay," I said, holding up my hands. "I just want to talk." He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and anger. Then, slowly, he lowered his head and began to cry. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he sobbed. "I didn't mean to do it." Seeing Kay break down like that caught me off guard. I'd expected rage, defiance, maybe even violence, but not this raw, unadulterated grief. It was like a dam had burst, releasing years of pent-up emotion. I cautiously approached him, my senses on high alert. He didn't react, just stood there, shoulders shaking, tears streaming down his face. "Kay," I said softly, "it's okay. You're okay." He looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen. "No, I'm not," he choked out. "I'm not okay. I'm a monster." "You're not a monster, Kay," I said, trying to sound convincing. "You just made a mistake. A really bad one. But that doesn't make you a monster." He shook his head, unconvinced. "Yes, it does. I hurt my sister. I could have killed her, but you didn't," I pointed out. "And you regret it. That means something, Kay." That means you're not a bad person. I knew I was grasping at straws, trying to find some semblance of hope in this mess. But I had to try. For Dad's sake. For Kay's sake. For everyone in this godforsaken house. "What do you want from me, Ethan?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I want you to tell me what's going on," I said. "Why did you do it, Kay? Why did you lash out like that?" He hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Then he took a deep breath and began to speak. It's like there's something inside me," he said, his voice trembling. "Something. Angry. It's always there, simmering beneath the surface. And sometimes it just boils over. I can't control it." He described the frustration, the overwhelming sense of being trapped, the feeling that everyone was against him. He talked about his struggles in school, his difficulty making friends, his constant battles with his mom over rules and boundaries. As he spoke, a clearer picture began to emerge. Kay wasn't just a violent, angry kid. He was a kid who was desperately struggling, a kid who felt lost and alone, a kid who was lashing out because he didn't know how else to cope. "The thing is, Ethan," he said, his voice cracking, "nobody understands. My mom tries, but she doesn't really get it. My caseworker just wants to give me pills. And Dad, he just yells at me." He looked at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. "You're the only one who's ever actually listened to me." The weight of his words hit me hard. I was just a 17-year-old kid, barely old enough to drive. But in that moment, I was the only person Kay felt he could trust. "I understand, Kay," I said, my voice sincere. "I understand what it's like to feel lost and alone, to feel like nobody understands." It was true. After Mom died, I'd felt the same way. Lost, adrift, with no one to turn to. But I'd had Dad, even if he was struggling with his own grief. Kay had no one. "What do I do, Ethan?" he asked, his voice desperate. "How do I make it stop?" "I don't know, Kay," I said honestly. "But I know you don't have to do it alone. We can find someone who can help you. A therapist, maybe? Someone who can teach you how to control your anger." He looked at me, skeptical. "You think that will work?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But it's worth a try, right? Anything is better than this." He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a glimmer of hope. "Okay," he said. "Okay, I'll try." Just then, Dad cleared his throat. He'd been standing silently in the doorway, listening to our conversation. His face was still pale, but there was a flicker of relief in his eyes. "Ethan's right, Kay," he said, his voice gentle. "We're going to get you help. Whatever it takes." Kay looked at his stepfather, his expression wary. "You promise?" Dad nodded. "I promise." The tension in the room began to dissipate, replaced by a fragile sense of hope. It was a long way from being resolved, but for the first time since I'd arrived, it felt like things were starting to move in the right direction. Then the police arrived. The flashing lights outside cast long, distorted shadows across the room. The sudden arrival of the police shattered the fragile peace we had managed to achieve. The sound of sirens cut through the air, a stark reminder of the gravity of the situation. Kay flinched, his eyes widening with fear. "What's happening?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Someone must have called them," Dad said grimly, his face hardening. He put a reassuring hand on Kay's shoulder. "It's okay, son. Just stay calm." Two officers entered the room, their expressions serious. "Are you Kay?" one of them asked, his voice firm but not accusatory. Kay nodded, his eyes fixed on the officers. "We need to talk to you about what happened," the officer said. "Can you tell us what happened here tonight?" I stepped forward, feeling a surge of protectiveness towards Kay. "Officer, he's been through a lot tonight. Can we do this later?" "He's agreed to get help." The officer looked at me, his expression unyielding. "I understand, son, but we have to follow procedure. A crime was committed here tonight. We need to get his statement." I knew arguing was futile. The law was the law. "Okay," I said, reluctantly stepping aside. But can I stay with him? He's more comfortable with me. The officer hesitated, then nodded. All right, but I need to hear everything he says. Kay recounted the events of the evening, his voice barely above a whisper. He admitted to grabbing the knife, to lashing out at his sister, to barricading himself in his room. He expressed remorse for his actions, his voice choked with emotion. As he spoke, I could see the officer's expressions soften slightly. They were professionals, but they were also human beings. They could see that Kay was genuinely remorseful, that he was struggling. When he finished his statement, the officers conferred briefly in the hallway. When they returned, their expressions were grave. Kay, one of the officers said, "We're going to have to take you into custody. We need to assess the situation, to determine what kind of help you need." Kay's face crumpled. "No," he cried. "Please, no! I don't want to go to jail." "You're not going to jail, son," Dad said quickly, his voice reassuring. "This is just a temporary measure. They just want to make sure you're safe and that everyone else is safe." But Kay wasn't listening. He was panicking, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. "I'm not going," he screamed, pulling away from the officers. "You can't make me." He lunged towards the dresser that was blocking the window, desperate to create an escape route. But he was too slow. The officers grabbed him, pinning him to the ground. Kay struggled against their grip, his screams echoing through the house. "Let me go! Let me go! I didn't do anything wrong." The scene was horrifying. I wanted to intervene, to protect him from the officers, but I knew it would only make things worse. As they dragged him out of the room, Kay looked at me, his eyes filled with terror and betrayal. "Ethan," he screamed. "Help me, please." I stood there, paralyzed, unable to do anything but watch as they led him away. His cries faded as they disappeared down the stairs, leaving a deafening silence in their wake. Dad slumped against the wall, his face buried in his hands. Deb rushed upstairs, her face pale with shock. The younger children huddled together in the living room, their eyes wide with fear. The house was once again filled with chaos, but this time it was a different kind of chaos. A chaos of grief, of fear, of despair. I felt a surge of anger, directed at everyone involved. At Kay for his violence, at the officers for their coldness, at Dad for his naivety, at myself for my helplessness. But most of all, I was angry at the system, at the broken system that had failed Kay, that had left him feeling so lost and alone that he had resorted to violence. As I stood there, watching the flashing lights of the police car disappear into the night, I knew that this was far from over. The intervention was just the beginning. The real work was just about to start, and I had a feeling it was going to be the hardest thing I'd ever done. The next few days were a living hell. The house felt empty, haunted by Kay's absence. The younger kids were withdrawn and scared, clinging to Deb like lifelines. Dad was a shell of himself, consumed by guilt and worry. He spent hours on the phone with lawyers, social workers, anyone who could offer a shred of hope. I stayed, mainly for Grandma's sake. She was a rock through all of this, offering quiet support to everyone, making sure we ate, even when we had no appetite. I helped where I could, trying to keep the younger kids occupied, distracting them from the unsettling silence. But inside, I was a mess. I kept replaying the scene of Kay being dragged away, his desperate cries echoing in my head. Had I done enough? Could I have done more? The questions gnawed at me, fueling a constant state of anxiety. The legal process crawled at a glacial pace. Kay was held in a juvenile detention center while the authorities assessed his mental state and determined the best course of action. Dad visited him every day, but Kay was withdrawn and unresponsive. He blamed himself. He blamed Dad. He blamed everyone but himself. Deb, meanwhile, was drowning in paperwork and phone calls, trying to navigate the complex web of social services. The strain was evident in her face, in the dark circles under her eyes, in the way she jumped at every unexpected sound. One evening, Dad came home looking particularly defeated. He sat down at the kitchen table, his shoulders slumped, and ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "They're recommending residential treatment," he said, his voice flat. "A specialized facility for kids with behavioral issues." Residential treatment. It sounded like a nicer term for what it really was, a lockdown facility. A place where they would try to fix Kay, to mold him into someone more manageable. "Is that good?" I asked, hesitant to voice my concerns. Dad sighed. "It's complicated. On the one hand, it's the best chance he has to get the intensive therapy he needs. On the other hand, it's going to be tough. He'll be away from home, away from his family, and there's no guarantee it will work." "What does Kay think?" "He's terrified," Dad admitted. "He thinks it's just another form of punishment, another way to get rid of him." I could understand his fear, being ripped away from everything he knew, even his dysfunctional family, and thrown into an unfamiliar environment filled with strangers. It was a terrifying prospect. "What can we do?" I asked, feeling a familiar surge of helplessness. "We can be there for him," Dad said, his voice regaining a sliver of determination. "We can visit him, call him, write him letters. We can show him that we haven't given up on him." He looked at me, his eyes pleading. "And I need you, Ethan. I need you to be there for him, too." I hesitated. I'd made it clear that I didn't want to be involved in Kay's life, that I didn't consider him family. But seeing the desperation in Dad's eyes, knowing how much he was hurting, I couldn't refuse. "Okay," I said, my voice quiet. "I'll visit him." The next day, Dad and I drove to the residential treatment facility. It was located in a remote, rural area, surrounded by high fences and security cameras. The atmosphere was sterile and impersonal, devoid of any warmth or comfort. We were led to a small visiting room where we waited for Kay. When he finally appeared, he looked even smaller and more vulnerable than I remembered. He was wearing a drab institutional uniform, his hair was unkempt, and his eyes were devoid of emotion. He sat down across from us, his body language closed off and defensive. He didn't meet our gaze, just stared blankly at the table. "Hey, Kay," Dad said gently. "How are you doing?" Kay shrugged. "Okay," he mumbled. "We brought you some things," Dad said, pulling out a small bag. "Some books, some magazines, a few of your favorite snacks." Kay didn't react. "We just wanted to let you know that we're thinking about you," Dad continued, his voice strained, "and that we're here for you, whatever you need." Still, no reaction. I decided to try a different approach. "Kay," I said, my voice calm and direct, "I know this sucks, but you don't have to go through it alone. We're here for you, and if you're willing to try, maybe, just maybe, this place can actually help you." He finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, a spark of hope, or maybe just resignation. "You really think so?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I'm willing to find out." "Are you?" He hesitated for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "Okay, I'll try." It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. It was a sign that Kay hadn't completely given up, that he was still willing to fight for himself, for his future. As we left the facility, I felt a glimmer of hope, a tiny spark in the darkness. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but at least we were moving forward. Together! The months that followed were a grueling test of patience and perseverance. Visiting Kay at the facility became a regular part of our routine. The visits were often difficult, filled with awkward silences and strained conversations. Kay struggled to open up, to trust the therapists, to confront his demons. There were setbacks, of course. Angry outbursts, periods of withdrawal, moments of despair. But there were also small victories. A breakthrough in therapy, a positive report from the staff, a flicker of genuine emotion in Kay's eyes. I tried my best to be supportive, to listen without judgment, to offer encouragement. I learned about his triggers, his anxieties, his deepest fears. I started to see him not as a monster, but as a damaged kid who desperately needed help. Dad and Deb were equally dedicated, attending therapy sessions, participating in family workshops, and doing everything they could to create a stable and supportive environment for Kay. They made mistakes along the way, but they were always willing to learn, to adapt, to try new approaches. Slowly, painstakingly, Kay began to make progress. He learned coping mechanisms for managing his anger. He developed healthier ways of expressing his emotions, and he started to take responsibility for his actions. He even began to form positive relationships with some of the other residents at the facility. One day, during one of our visits, Kay looked at me, his eyes clear and focused, and said, "Thank you, Ethan." "For what?" I asked, surprised. "For not giving up on me," he said. "For being there for me, even when I didn't deserve it." His words hit me hard. I realized that I had come a long way from the resentful, angry kid who had refused to acknowledge Kay as family. I had seen his pain, I had listened to his struggles, and I had started to care about him. "You do deserve it, Kay," I said, my voice sincere. "Everyone deserves a second chance." The day Kay was released from the facility was a day of celebration. The whole family, Dad, Deb, the younger kids, even Grandma and Grandpa, gathered at the house to welcome him home. Kay was nervous, but also excited. He had been away for so long, and he was eager to reconnect with his family, to start a new chapter in his life. The transition was not easy. There were still challenges to overcome, old habits to break, trust to rebuild. But with the help of ongoing therapy, a supportive family, and Kay's own determination, things slowly began to improve. He started attending a new school, where he found teachers who understood his struggles and were willing to work with him. He made a few friends, kids who accepted him for who he was, flaws and all. He even started to participate in extracurricular activities, joining a photography club and volunteering at a local animal shelter. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, watching TV with Dad, when Kay came downstairs. He was carrying a framed photograph, a picture he had taken at the animal shelter. "Hey, Ethan," he said, his voice hesitant. "I wanted to show you something." He handed me the photograph. It was a picture of a scruffy, abandoned dog, its eyes filled with sadness and loneliness. But in the photograph, there was also a glimmer of hope, a sense of resilience. "I call him Hope," Kay said, smiling slightly. "He reminds me of myself." I looked at the photograph, then at Kay. I saw the same glimmer of hope in his eyes, the same sense of resilience. He had come a long way, from the angry, violent kid who had terrorized his family to a compassionate, caring young man who was determined to make a difference in the world. "It's a great picture, Kay," I said, handing it back to him. "You have a real talent." He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. "Thanks, Ethan." He hung the photograph on the wall, next to a collection of family photos. As I watched him, I realized that he had finally found his place in our family. He was no longer an outsider, a threat, a burden. He was one of us, and I was proud to call him my brother. Years have passed since Kay's return. Life isn't perfect, but it's good. Real. The kind of good that's earned, not given. The kind of good that's built on forgiveness and understanding. Kay is in his early 20s now, attending community college, studying photography. He's found a passion, a purpose. He still has his struggles, his bad days, but he's learned to manage them, to reach out for help when he needs it. He's even become an advocate for mental health awareness, sharing his story with other young people who are struggling with similar issues. He's a beacon of hope for those who feel lost and alone. The younger kids have grown up too. They're teenagers now, navigating the challenges of adolescence. But they're strong, resilient, and incredibly supportive of Kay. They see him not as the monster he once was, but as a brother who loves them unconditionally. Dad and Deb are thriving. They've learned to communicate better, to set healthy boundaries, to create a loving and supportive environment for their blended family. They're not perfect parents, but they're good parents. They've shown me what it truly means to love unconditionally, even when it's difficult. As for me, I'm in my early 20s as well, working towards a degree in social work. Kay's journey inspired me to dedicate my life to helping others who are struggling with mental health issues. I want to be the person that Kay needed when he was at his lowest point. I still think about Mom, of course. I wonder what she would think of Kay, of our family. I think she would be proud of us, proud of the way we've overcome our challenges, proud of the way we've learned to love and accept each other. The anger, the resentment, the fear, it's all gone now, replaced by something much stronger, a deep sense of love, compassion, and understanding. One sunny afternoon, I was sitting on the porch with Dad, watching Kay teach his younger sister how to use a camera. The scene was peaceful, idyllic, a far cry from the chaos and turmoil of years past. "You know," Dad said, his voice quiet, "I never thought we'd get here. I never thought we'd be a real family." "Me neither," I admitted. "I was so scared," he continued, his voice trembling slightly. "I was afraid that I was going to lose everything. You, Kay, the kids. You didn't lose anything, Dad," I said, putting a hand on his shoulder. "You gained a family? A real family." He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I did." We sat there in silence for a few moments, watching Kay and his sister. The sound of their laughter filled the air, a testament to the healing power of love and forgiveness. I looked at Dad, at the lines etched on his face, at the love shining in his eyes. I realized that he had been right all along. We were a family, a messy, complicated, imperfect family, but a family nonetheless, and I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world.